Copying a successful company almost always backfires, and most managers never figure out why. They assume the advice failed because they executed it badly. Usually, that is not the reason at all. The real reason has a name. It is called survivorship bias, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it in almost every piece of business advice you have ever been handed. Here is where the idea comes from, and it is worth knowing the full story, because the mechanism inside it is exactly the mechanism hiding inside your industry's favorite success stories. During World War II, engineers were trying to solve a real and urgent problem. Bomber planes were getting shot down at an alarming rate, and every plane lost meant a lost crew. The military needed to add armor to the aircraft to improve survival odds. But armor is heavy, and heavy planes fly worse, burn more fuel, and carry less. You cannot armor plate the entire aircraft. You have to choose where the armor goes, and that choice has to be based on data, not guesswork. So the engineers did the sensible thing. They studied the bombers that made it back from missions. They walked the tarmac and mapped every bullet hole across the wings, the tail, and the fuselage of the returning planes. Over time, a clear pattern emerged. Certain sections were absolutely riddled with holes, wingtips, tail sections, parts of the body of the plane, while other areas showed comparatively few hits. The obvious conclusion, the one that felt almost too easy, was to reinforce the areas that were covered in bullet holes. That is where the damage clearly was. That is where the plane needed protecting, or so it seemed. A statistician named Abraham Wald was brought in to look at the numbers, and he saw something the engineers had missed entirely. Wald pointed out that the dataset itself was broken in a very specific way. Every single plane in that study had one thing in common. It had survived the mission and made it back to base to be examined. The planes with holes concentrated in the wings and tail were not proof that those areas were the most dangerous. They were proof of the opposite. Those planes took hits in the wings and tail and still flew home. The wings and tail could absorb damage, and the plane could still survive. Those planes survived despite being hit there, not because of it. The real danger, Wald argued, was hiding in a place the engineers could not see, precisely because their method made it invisible. The real danger zones were the spots with no bullet holes on the returning planes, not because bullets never landed there, but because any plane hit in those spots never made it back to be studied at all. Those planes went down over enemy territory, or crashed into the sea, or simply never returned to the formation. The sections with suspiciously few holes in the survivor data were exactly the sections that needed armor, because a hit there was fatal, and a fatal hit produces no data point at all. It just produces an empty chair and a plane that never lands. This is the core mechanism of survivorship bias, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is deceptively simple, and yet it fools smart, careful people constantly. You are not just missing some of the data when you study only survivors. You are missing exactly the data that matters most, systematically, every single time, because the very thing you are studying, success or survival, is the filter that removed the failures from your sample before you ever got to look at it. It is not a random gap in the evidence. It is a targeted, invisible gap shaped exactly like the question you are trying to answer, which is what makes it so easy to miss even when you are looking directly at the numbers. It helps to think about why this trap is so easy to fall into in the first place. Humans are pattern-seeking by nature. Handed a pile of data about winners, the brain wants to find the thread connecting them, because a tidy explanation feels safer than admitting the honest answer might be closer to unclear causes and a fair amount of luck. A clean story is also simply easier to act on. Reinforce the bullet holes is a concrete instruction. Consider the planes that never came home, and try to reason about what might have hit them is a much harder, murkier task. And murky tasks get avoided in favor of confident, decisive-sounding ones, especially under deadline pressure. There is also a quieter incentive problem sitting underneath all of this, and it is worth naming plainly. Case studies, magazine profiles, and keynote talks are, almost by definition, stories about survivors. A journalist cannot interview a company that no longer exists. A conference cannot book a founder who has already moved on to an unrelated job. The entire machinery that produces business advice, the articles, the panels, the best-selling books, is structurally built to only ever look at the winners, because the losers are simply unavailable to be studied. That is not a conspiracy. Nobody is deliberately hiding the failures. The failures are just gone, and gone companies do not answer emails from reporters. The result is the same either way. The advice you consume is quietly pre-filtered before you ever see it, shaped entirely by who happened to still be standing when someone showed up with a notebook. Now, take that mechanism and walk it straight into a boardroom, because business advice falls into the exact same trap constantly, almost word for word. A magazine or a conference speaker studies 10 wildly successful startups. They interview the founders, they pull the financials, they look for what these companies have in common, and they find patterns. Maybe all 10 skipped formal market research and just built the product and shipped it. Maybe all 10 had a scrappy 2-person founding team working out of a small office rather than a large, well-funded team with a full department for everything. The magazine writes it up. The advice gets repeated everywhere. On stages, in books, in every newsletter, chasing the same headline, until it becomes accepted wisdom that skipping market research and staying lean with 2 founders is a winning formula. But nobody studies the thousands of failed startups that did the exact same things and quietly disappeared. Somewhere out there, thousands of founding teams also skipped market research. Thousands of companies also launched with 2 scrappy founders in a small office. Almost none of them succeeded. Almost none of them got written up. They ran out of money, they folded, the founders took new jobs, and the world moved on without a single case study marking what happened. Nobody flies out to interview the founder of a company that shut down a year and a half in. There is no conference panel called What We Got Wrong and Why Nobody Remembers Us. The failures leave no bullet holes for anyone to study because the plane never came home in the first place. This means the visible winners are not necessarily doing anything uniquely right. That is the uncomfortable part, the part that is hard to sit with if you have spent years admiring a competitor's playbook. The winners might have succeeded because of something else entirely, a market that happened to be underserved at exactly the right moment, a relationship nobody wrote about, timing that had nothing to do with strategy, or plain luck on a factor nobody was even tracking. They may have survived despite skipping market research, the same way a bomber survived despite taking a hit in the wing. The skipped market research was not armor. It was a wound the company happened to be able to absorb for reasons that had nothing to do with the choice itself. It is worth noticing how this same pattern shows up far beyond startups, because once you know the shape of it, you start seeing it everywhere in ordinary workplace life. Think about how often a team celebrates a process because the one project that used it happened to succeed, while quietly ignoring every other project that used the exact same process and delivered nothing memorable. Think about how a hiring manager notices that a great employee skipped a certain credential and quietly begins undervaluing that credential in every future hire, without ever counting the far larger group of candidates who also skipped it and did not work out. The mechanism never changes, only the setting does. Consider a team that adopts a new working style, because a well-known company is famous for it. Long hours, unusual meeting structures, a flat reporting line with no formal management layer. The story circulates as proof that the style works. What almost never circulates alongside it is a count of how many companies tried an identical structure and folded, or quietly reverted back to something more conventional after it caused chaos. The famous company is not lying about its own history. It genuinely did use that structure, and it genuinely did succeed. But one confirmed success paired with an unknown, uncounted number of quiet failures is not evidence that the structure works. It is evidence that the structure is survivable for at least one company, under one particular set of circumstances that may never repeat. The same logic applies to individual careers inside a company, not just to companies themselves. A rising manager takes a bold risk, skips a step other people consider mandatory, and gets promoted anyway. The story spreads through the office as proof that boldness pays off, that the safe, conventional path is for people who lack nerve. Nobody tells the story of the equally bold colleague who took the same kind of risk and was quietly let go because that person is no longer around to be talked about at the next town hall. The lesson employees absorb from watching only the promoted risk-taker is exactly the same broken lesson the engineers almost applied to the bombers. Reinforce wherever you see the visible hit, and ignore the far larger, silent population that took the identical hit and did not come home. But here is the part nobody expects, and it is the part that should genuinely unsettle you if you run a team or make strategic calls for a living. It is not just that the survivors are a biased sample. It is that the very confidence with which a success story gets told is itself a kind of camouflage. The more inspiring the story, the more polished the case study, the more certain everyone in the room feels about the lesson, the less anyone stops to ask what the graveyard of identical attempts actually looked like. Confidence is not evidence. A great story is not the same thing as a sound strategy. And honestly, the louder and cleaner a success narrative sounds, the more suspicious a careful manager should be of it, not less, because a clean narrative is usually a sign that someone has already thrown away the messy, inconvenient data about everyone who tried the same thing and quietly failed. That is the sharper way to say it, and it is worth repeating to your team the next time someone pitches a strategy just because it worked for a famous competitor. The strength of a success story tells you almost nothing about whether the underlying tactic actually caused the success. It only tells you that this particular company happened to succeed. So what does a manager actually do with this, beyond feeling appropriately suspicious of every keynote speech? Managers copying a competitor's public playbook should ask a harder question first, before adopting a single tactic. How many companies tried this same approach and failed silently, leaving no case study behind, no interview, no panel, nothing but a closed office and a domain name that quietly expired? That question will not always have a clean answer. Sometimes you genuinely cannot find out how many others tried and failed, because by definition those failures did not leave records behind for anyone to study. But the discipline of asking the question changes how you evaluate the evidence sitting in front of you. It forces you to treat any single success story as one data point pulled from an unknown and probably very large population, rather than as a proven formula simply waiting to be copied. Practically, that might mean looking past the polished profile of the winner and trying to talk to people who tried something similar and quit, competitors who folded quietly, employees who left failed ventures in the same space, anyone who can describe the version of this idea that did not work out. It might mean treating any borrowed tactic as a hypothesis worth testing at small scale first, rather than a proven playbook to roll out company-wide overnight. It might simply mean building in enough humility that when a strategy borrowed from a competitor does not produce the same results for your own team, you do not automatically assume you executed it badly. You consider the much more likely possibility that the tactic was never actually the reason for their success in the first place, and that you were never really copying the thing that mattered. There is a broader habit worth building here, and it applies well beyond any single playbook decision. Whenever a team gets excited about a pattern found only among winners, whether that is a hiring trait, a marketing channel, a pricing model, or a management style, the useful move is to pause and ask what the losing group looked like on that same trait. If a hiring manager notices that several strong performers skipped a certain type of experience, the honest next step is to check how many weak performers, or people who did not get hired at all, also skipped it. If a product team notices that a feature shipped right before a successful quarter, the honest next step is to ask how many quarters had that same feature ship and nothing improved. This is slower than simply repeating the story that feels good. It is also the only way to tell the difference between an actual cause and a coincidence that happened to survive long enough to be noticed. None of this means competitor research is worthless, or that studying successful companies has no value at all. It means the study is incomplete on its own. The way a bomber patched only in the spots where returning planes were hit would still be incomplete, no matter how much data went into the decision. The missing half of the picture, the failures, the planes that never landed, the founders nobody interviewed, is not a footnote. It is very often the more important half, precisely because it is the half that got filtered out before anyone in the room ever had a chance to see it. There is also a simple team habit that makes this easier to catch in real time, and it costs almost nothing to install. Before greenlighting any strategy pitched because it worked somewhere else, have someone in the room ask, out loud, in front of everyone, who tried this and failed, not as a gotcha, and not to kill every idea borrowed from outside. Simply as a standing question, asked every time, The same way a pilot runs a checklist before takeoff, regardless of how many times the plane has flown safely before. Most of the time, nobody in the room will have a full answer, and that is fine. The value is not in always getting the answer. The value is in the pause itself. The moment where the room remembers that the shiny case study in front of them is one plane on one runway, not the whole sky. Success stories are written by survivors, and survivors, by definition, cannot tell you what killed everyone else who tried the same thing. Good decisions require studying the failures too, deliberately and on purpose, even though that takes more effort than reading one glossy magazine profile, because the failures are the ones with the real lesson buried inside them. Admiring a wreckage-free plane sitting safely back on the runway feels good, and it makes for a compelling slide in a strategy deck. It teaches you almost nothing about where the real danger was actually hiding the entire time. Follow along for more lessons from real companies. Before you adopt any borrowed playbook, stop admiring the plane sitting safely on the runway and start asking about the ones that never made it home. Ask who else tried the same move you are about to make. Ask what happened to them, especially the ones nobody ever wrote an article about, because those silent failures, not the polished case study sitting in front of you, are where the real risk in your decision is actually hiding.